Alrighty, so at this point, I've really covered, I think, the most essential features of ES2015. We've covered string literals or template strings rather. We've covered arrow functions, and we've covered let and const. So now we're going to get into features that are more circumstantial, but are still incredibly, incredibly important. And this is actually going to be one of my favorite ones that I use. It's not something you'll use all the time, but when you do need to use it, it cleans up your code a lot. And that is variable deconstructing. So to start off this example, I'm going to come over here to my public folder, grab my o2 variables.html, and I'm going to copy and paste it by just hitting Control-C, Control-V, and then I'm going to rename it to o3 deconstructing. And then for the scripts, I'm going to change it from o2 variables to o3 deconstructing. And then I'm going to try and fail to copy that. And I'm going to come over here to my source scripts, right-click, new file, and put in o3 deconstructing.js. And then I'm going to open up my self-executing function to keep my, my namespace clean. And I'm going to come over here and make sure I hit Control-S to make sure I save that HTML file. And I'll pop open Chrome, jump back over here, and open up the HTML folder or file. Do note that I do have BabbleWatch running in the background, and I also have the HTTP server running in the background on the public folder. All right, so I'm going to open up Deconstructing.js, split my screen here, and then open up scripts Deconstructing.js. And let's go ahead and get started. So what is deconstructing? Well, deconstructing is simply extracting values from objects or arrays in a super compact way. So let's start off with a simple example. I'm going to create an object, and I'm going to call him person. He's just going to be a straightforward JavaScript object. He's going to have a name that's going to have a first of Nelson and a last of Lakay. And he's going to have a roles of an admin, and he's going to have isActive set to true. So we now have our awesome person guy that we can deconstruct. So what do I mean by deconstructing? How does that? What does that do? Well, let's create a function called printPerson that takes in a person, and let's say that we have a lot of things to do with his name or his roles or something. And so normally we would let's say we console log out person.roles. And then we also console log out person roles length, right? So we're reaching in and we're referencing person.roles, this roles array, but we're doing it twice and we're kind of getting repetitive. So an obvious solution to this repetitiveness, something that people should be doing when they see themselves in this pattern of constantly referencing a property on an object graph, is we can alias it out with a variable. I can simply say const roles equals person.roles. And now I can access that roles directly because I've effectively aliased out this property. So far, really straightforward. But let's say that I also need to alias out his name. So I can say const first name equals person.name.first. And let's say I want to do const last name equals person name last. And then somewhere else I console log out first name and last name, and so on and so on. So you see right here that this is a very common pattern where we have an object. We know what's in that object, but we want to access these potentially very deeply nested properties. So we alias them out into local variables. Very, very common practice. But this gets really, really, really tiresome. So let's go ahead and see how ES2015 can make this a whole lot easier. I'm going to write another function. I'm going to call this printPerson2. It's going to take a person. But instead of doing const roles equals person.roles, I'm going to do const, and then I'm going to open up some curly braces. So this is the new syntax. In previous versions of JavaScript, this syntax did not exist. And then I'm going to say roles, and I'm going to say equals person. And then I'll console log out roles as well as roles.length. Then I'll hit Control-S. This is an example of deconstructing. So what I'm doing is, because I have these curly braces, I am extracting out the roles property of this object and assigning it to a local variable called roles. And in fact, we can look over here on our compiled JavaScript and we can see that it's basically equivalent. It's literally equivalent to what we were doing before. But it gets better than that. What if I wanted his name? Well, you can actually, in the same deconstruction, you can provide as many things that you want to extract as you want. So I can just say, comma name. And now I've grabbed his name. But that might not necessarily help me, because notice up here, we're grabbing his first name and his last name, right? But here we're just grabbing the whole name object. So we still have to do name.first and name.last. So we can actually go deeper with the deconstructing syntax. And to do that, instead of just extracting name, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say name colon, and then open up more curlies and say first, comma, last. And then hit Control S. And as you probably would have guessed, the code is almost completely identical to the code we wrote by hand. Now, it's a little different. We have this temporary object floating around here, but that's okay. That's been generated by Babel. We don't care about that. That doesn't affect anything. So, yeah, so now we've actually extracted his first last name, and we can go ahead and now say console log first and console log, oops, that's not how you spell console, last. And now you can see that I'm referencing these variables that I extracted out of this deeply nested object. And this is the essence of deconstructing. The essence of deconstructing is extracting properties out of an object so that you don't have to repeat yourself a bunch of times in order to alias out values into local variables, which again is a common practice, and you should be doing it when you reference a deeply nested property multiple times in a function. You should be extracting it out to a variable for readability. Deconstructing makes it super easy, and the syntax might put you off a little bit at first. So we have this weird curly brace here, and we also have this kind of weird syntax where we have this name colon. It kind of looks like a JavaScript object, but it's not a JavaScript object. This is just the special deconstructing syntax. But yeah, that's the general gist of it. The general gist is straightforward. The only thing you might have to work on is kind of memorizing the syntax a little bit. But it's super useful, and the concept is simple. But we can do even better than this. Deconstructing also works in function parameters. So check this out. I can do function printPerson3, but printPerson3 is not going to take in a person object. He is going to deconstruct that person object right in the parameter list itself. So I'm simply going to open up a curly, and I'm going to say roles, comma, name colon, first, last, and hit Control S. And you notice that I basically took this exact deconstructing syntax and I applied it to the parameters itself. So right here, there's only one parameter to print person3, and I can show that by showing the compiled code. The compiled code results in one parameter. Now, I could add normal parameters if I wanted to. I could say normal param1, for example. And you'll notice normal param1 does show up. But when I want to deconstruct something, I simply open up a curly brace and use the deconstructing syntax. And all the deconstructing happens in the body. So now I can say console log roles. And if I went and said print person3, specifying null for that dummy normal param1 parameter, but then specifying person as its second parameter. If I came up into Chrome and hit F5, notice how the roles are indeed printed. So this is a really, really cool feature. It actually gets really interesting for kind of structure-y things. So when I say structure-y things, I mean things like point, something that has an x and y position. For example, if I had a const point that had an x value of 1 and a y value of 24, and let's say I wanted to make a function that translated this point. So I say function translate, that takes in a point, but I'm not going to take in a single point object. I'm going to take in a deconstructing thing here, and I'm going to pass an x comma y, and then I'm going to pass an amount, and then I'm simply going to return x equals x plus amount, y equals y plus amount. Hit Control S. And now you notice that I deconstructed that point object and translated it. So if I say console log translate point by 20, and then went over into Chrome and hit F5, notice how 20 has been added to both of those points coordinates. Now we could even do better than that. I mean, again, this is really useful for like point-like structures and stuff. I could go ahead and say const new point equals, or whoops, I could say something like x comma y equals translate, passing in point by 10. So now I'm doing deconstruction here, and I'm doing deconstruction on the function side and on the receiving end as well. So again, super useful for smaller structures like that. Another really cool example would be defaults. So let's say I had a function called getTrack, and getTrack returned an object that had a title of track1 and a length in seconds of 30, right? And let's say I wanted to go ahead and I wanted to extract data from this method after invoking it. So I would do something like const title, comma, length in seconds. But let's say I also want to optionally receive a description. So let's say I could say description equals no desk found. And then I'll simply invoke our awesome getTrack method. So here's an example of how I can do deconstruction, but if this getTrack method or function does not return an object that has a description field, it'll automatically be assigned to no description found. And you can see that code over here on the right-hand side. So I get the track, I invoke the getTrack method, I extract the title, I extract the length in seconds, then I extract the description. But you'll see right here with this ternary, if the description was not found, as in it is equivalent to undefined, return no description found, otherwise return the description itself. So that's a really cool way to kind of do default parameters when you're deconstructing things. Alrighty, so that's objects. Again, syntax a little wonky to get used to, but super useful. Cleans up your code significantly. Oh, by the way, I've been using const this whole time, but the same would work with if you wanted to use var or let. Both would work just fine. Of course, like I said in the last video, I'm going to be using const every single time that I can when I write the code, and I highly encourage you guys to get in that habit as well. But anyway, so that's objects. Let's talk about arrays, because you can deconstruct arrays as well. So for arrays, there's kind of three little pieces of syntax for them. So let's start off with declaring an array. I'm going to declare an array, and it's going to be a really, really, really boring array. It's just going to be numbers. And there's three ways to three little special syntaxes when deconstructing an array. First of all, I can say const first num, comma second num, and third num if I wanted to, however many I want to, equals array. And of course, Babel sometimes does this, where it forgets that it's supposed to work. And to fix that, when you're doing the watching, to fix that, just hit space and hit Control S again, and it'll come back for you. Anyway, so let's scroll down to the bottom here. So here's an example of, oh, whoops, I used the wrong syntax. I was doing so many object deconstructions that I forgot that we use square brackets. So I'm going to leave this in the video just so I emphasize that when deconstructing arrays, you use the square bracket syntax instead of the curly brace syntax, which makes sense because that's how it works in JSON as well. Anyway, so to deconstruct this array, I'm simply providing a deconstruction with square brackets. And as you see right here, it aliased out the first value, the second value, and the third value. There's another piece of syntax to work with deconstructing arrays. Let's say I wanted to do X, Y, but then I wanted to skip the third item. So I add an empty comma and then get Z. Of course, I'm not going to be able to do that because I've already defined an X and a Y above. So let's just do X1, Y1, Z1 and hit Control S. And as you see, what happens is when you put this empty comma in, and you can put as many as you want in there, notice how it skips over values. So X1 is the first item, Y1 is the second item, and Z is going to be the 8th item. All right, the last way that we can use the deconstructing arrays is going to be using the spread operator. So what I can do is I can say, let's say head1, head2, ... rest equals array. So what does that do? What does this ... do? No, you notice that these are periods, these are not commas, and there's specifically 3 of them. Well, what it does is it'll grab the first couple values, and then it'll go out and it'll put the rest of those values after 1 and 2 into the rest parameter. So in this case, we're using array.slice to retrieve the rest of those values. So this is a really handy way to where if you only care about the first couple elements of the array, but you still need to retrieve the rest of the elements of the array, you would use this syntax. Now note that it is not legal to add any other comma values at the end of this. So I can't say comma tail. That actually threw an error up at the top of my screen with the Babel compiler. So once you do the rest, that's all you're allowed to get during the deconstruction. So one way to use this might be let's write a really esoteric sum function. This is going to be fun. I'm going to write a recursive sum function. Not something you would ever do in production, but a lot of algorithms use this sort of functional recursion, where what we do is we're working on an array, but then we need to extract the first item of the array and then the rest of those items. Then we invoke ourselves, we add the head onto a recursive invocation of the tail being the rest of the items in the array, and we recursively invoke this function with that altered array. So we pop one element off the array, and then we call ourselves again with the rest of those items that are left on the array. So again, a really esoteric sum function. And it's just kind of fun to write. So I can say console log sum, and then I'll just pass in my array. And by doing that, I can go ahead and prove that it works by opening up Chrome and refreshing and seeing that 28 is printed out, which is the sum of all those items. So yeah, stuff and things. Another fun thing you can do, you'll see this in examples everywhere when looking at ES2015 code, is swapping. So for example, let's say I have a let left equals 10 and a, let left, and a left right equals 20. Let's say I wanted to swap these two variables. I can go ahead and say left comma right equals right comma left. And that'll actually go out and swap these variables for me. Now, this is an incredibly inefficient way to swap variables, but I'm just pointing out that that you'll see this example a lot in different documentation, and it is a completely valid way to do array deconstruction. And honestly, I think it kind of looks cool, to be perfectly honest. But yeah. The last thing I want to do is talk about default parameters. Didn't quite know where to stuff this in because we've pretty much beaten deconstruction to death. It's something that I highly encourage you guys get a lot of practice with, so it kind of comes out naturally while you're writing code. Because I guarantee you, once you start using deconstruction, in certain circumstances, obviously not all of them, your code will become a lot cleaner. But I just wanted to shove default parameters in here because it's kind of similar to what we were talking about, and it's pretty straightforward. So JavaScript now supports default parameters. So I can say with defaults, I can go ahead and I'll write a normal parameter first, person, and then I'll write a output. But let's say we want this output parameter to have a default value. So I'm going to say equals name. And we can also do default values for more complex options, more complex parameters. So I can say options equals verbose is equivalent or equals true. So I'll go ahead and say console log person, comma output, comma options. And then I'm going to invoke this with different parameters here. So if we look at the code, we see that var output, for example, is extracted from the arguments array, but only if it exists. And if it doesn't exist, name is used. Now the exact same pattern is used for options. So if options doesn't exist, it's set to this object that I declared right here. So let's see that in action. I can go ahead and say with default, passing in, let's go ahead and pass in a person. So that's a default for everything, but I could also do with default, pass in person, and then do maybe is active for the output, and then for our options, pass in debug equals true, or something like that. This is just arbitrary things that I'm pulling out of my head right now. And if we come back to Chrome and hit F5, we see that the first invocation indeed got our default values. We got our person that we passed in. Then for the second parameter, we got output equals name. And for the third parameter, we got verbose equals true. But the second time we invoked it, we satisfied all of the parameters. So we still get our person as our first argument. For our second, we get is active that we specified there. And for our third, we get an object that says debug equals true. Notice that it doesn't merge the object in. I guess if I'm going to point out anything, that's a potential pitfall that you might fall into. When you assign a default to a parameter that is an object, it's not going to merge those properties into the object that you passed in. It is an all or nothing sort of thing. But it's a very straightforward syntax. A lot of languages has this syntax, and I figured it was worth pointing out. But I think that pretty much wraps up this video. So that's object and array deconstruction. Pretty straightforward stuff. But I think it's lots of fun. Just be sure to get used to the syntax because it does look a little wonky, I'll give you that. Anyway, we'll see you guys in the next video.